Hello and welcome to Gritty Film's Nitty Griddy review for the 2006 fantasy movie Pan's Labyrinth. This was written and directed by Guillermo del Toro and is starring Ivana Baquero and Maribel Verdú. It's rated R for some graphic violence and language. If you haven't seen Pan's Labyrinth, it's kind of like if the movie's The Little Princess and Children of Men had a baby that grew up in war-torn 1940s Spain. Why not? The first category is going to be genre, and this is a fantasy movie, but it's also very much so a fairy tale. I like that Pan's Labyrinth in a lot of ways pays tribute to a lot of children's fantasy movies that came before it, like The Little Princess, The Wizard of Oz, Alice in Wonderland, but it also doesn't shy away from going dark, and it almost feels like a Lost Brothers Grimm type fairy tale. Has a lot of violence, a lot of death, and plays on these very heavy themes, which is very true to original fairy tales that, weren't Disney princess stories. They were very dark and dealt with adult themes. The ending, as just kind of a twist to the genre, technically for Ophelia, it is a happy ending. She's reunited with her parents, and she finds this life where she doesn't have to be bound to Earth. She doesn't have to deal with death and pain and sadness. But then you have the flip side of that, where you have those left behind who have no idea that this fantasy world exists, and they're just left mourning Ophelia's death. They don't get that release from the real world that Ophelia does. And I thought that was really well done, that you still have technically a happy ending, but it's presented in such a way that it's also a tragedy. For the genre category, I gave this one a 10 out of 10. Like many of the categories we're going to be going through, it was just perfect. And particularly because fairy tales aren't typically a genre made for adults. I like that it was able to be very true to the genre while still made for adults. The next category is going to be writing. One of the first things I always look at with writing is the journey that the hero goes through. In Pan's Labyrinth, it's going to be Ophelia. And I really like that she has very clear and distinct internal needs and external goals. Externally, she has obviously the 3 trials. It's very straightforward. And then she also has internal needs that aren't explicitly stated. She needs a father figure. She needs security and safety. She needs a family, and she needs to find out who she is within that family unit, which I think is really interesting because she does start off with her mother and her unborn brother, and they are a very strong unit, but then they get thrown into this environment. She has this stepfather now. Her mother wants her to call him father, and she doesn't want to, obviously. So there's just a lot of interesting conflicts going on internally that aid in the external goal, because she wants to finish the trials, to be reunited with her father, and just to be away from war and death and pain. I also like that within the quests, she technically fails 2 of the 3 tasks. She had agency, and she kind of created her own story, and in so doing proved herself to the fawn and ultimately to her father. The characters were a little bit one-dimensional, which I think actually plays into the fairy tale genre very well. I wish we had gotten a little bit more character development, particularly with characters like Carmen, who I think was a really interesting character that maybe could have been developed just a little bit more. I just wanted to know a little bit more about the decision she made. I don't need to know every answer. I like that things are open-ended. I like that we don't know every single thing. But that's one character particularly that I just wanted to know a little bit more about. Just know why she's making these decisions. I gave the writing category an 8.8, which I consider to be a solid A. Really the only thing that knocked it down was some of the character arcs and development that I wish had just been a little bit stronger. I was probably a little bit harsher on it in this movie than I would in a lot of other movies, just because it was so perfect in pretty much every other category. But still, an 8.8 out of 10 is still well above average and very strong. The next category is going to be the editing and the special effects. I think one of the biggest things that stood out for me was the scene with the giant toad. And I do understand this movie. I mean, it was made in 2006. Technology has come a huge way in the last almost 12 years. They had a lot of trouble. They did actually build like a giant puppet, but it wasn't really able to move around. So they had to, do a lot of last minute changes. just to get it to look right. You know, the scene they have, it's a good scene, but I just wish they'd been able to get the puppet to work, because anytime you can have a practical effect, 9 times out of 10 it's gonna look way better than computer generated, particularly at that time. It's getting to where that's not necessarily true now. There are a lot of scenes that have the CGI that work a lot better than that scene. There's the slash in Vidal's mouth that looks really good. The legs of both the fawn and the pale man were largely CGI. Things like that. There's definitely very good CGI, but that one scene, it takes me out of the movie enough that I did have to take a few points off. Another slight issue I had with the editing was the pacing in the pale man scene. It's not awful by any means, and it's still one of the best scenes in the movie. It just seems like a very long chase scene in which he probably should have gotten a little bit closer to her. It just seemed like it maybe should have been either cut a little bit shorter or maybe filmed a little bit differently. Just something to make it a little bit more suspenseful or a little bit more believable that this monster never caught up with her. And again, probably being a little bit more harsh on some of these things than I would be in other movies, just because there's very few flaws in this movie. One aspect of the editing that I really, really like is the use of transitions. There's a lot of camera movement that turns into kind of a swipe from one scene to the next, and it's used very effectively to kind of combine in a way like the real world versus the fantasy world. And you also get almost feels like a page is turning, which almost kind of adds to the fairy tale feel as well. For the editing category, I gave it an 8 out of 10, which is going to be an A-. Editing is really, really strong. I think editing a lot of times kind of gets lost in the background. Classical editing is also called invisible cuts, because you're not really supposed to notice it. And in this movie, you do notice it a little bit more, but it aids the storytelling in pretty significant ways. The next category is going to be sound design. And in this case, the score alone is probably enough to give this category a 10 out of 10. It has simplicity, it's got that lullaby feel, and yet it has a hauntingness to it. And it's just beautiful. It's a part of the story. It becomes, it's diegetic at times, which I think really aids in just the emotional impact of the score overall. It's just beautiful. There's also a general soundscape throughout the movie that really aids in the storytelling and the world building. It's just really full-bodied, I guess. It's not a cluttered soundscape throughout the movie, but it is very complex and just really aids the story, which, that's pretty much my number one. If something sounds really cool or looks really cool but does nothing to tell the story, I'm probably not going to pay too much extra attention to it. But in this movie, there's so many perfect scores within these categories because everything aids the story in such a specific way. And sound design is no exception. So for sound design overall, I gave it a 10 out of 10. Perfect. The next category is going to be acting and casting. For this movie, it was a little bit harder for me to judge because I don't speak Spanish. One of the many reasons I wish I spoke Spanish would be so that I could, understand the movie or appreciate the movie on a deeper level. A lot of my time was spent reading the subtitles, and I wasn't able to focus as much on the facial expressions or body language or even the tone or the way, the words were delivered. Certainly that comes across, but it's just harder to pay full attention to those types of details when you're also reading the dialogue. However, from what I could see and hear and understand, and from what I know about the actors, it was extremely well cast with very talented actors. So for acting and casting, I gave it a 10 out of 10. Perfect score. The next category is going to be the directing and the cinematography. I think it's no surprise that pretty much down the line within the grid, it's perfect scores. This is one of those movies that's mentioned in almost every filmmaking textbook at some point, usually when talking about lighting. And there's a reason for that. It's one of the most beautiful films ever shot. Lighting and the color palettes really add to not just the mood and the beauty. There's also a clear distinction between the fantasy world and the real world, with the real world being colder and harsher and the fantasy world being warmer. The camera movement throughout is just some of the most beautiful camera work I think I've seen possibly ever. Guillermo del Toro describes it as kind of a ballet with the camera. We're between the camera and the actor. It's choreographed. It's has a flow to it, and it certainly has a beauty to it the way a dance would. So I love the camera movement throughout. The lighting is amazing. The mise-en-scène, I have some really good shots in there, particularly with the fawn and Ophelia. Those are some of my favorite shots. There's a quote in the audio commentary for the movie that I really love. Guillermo del Toro was talking about the transitions that I was talking about earlier. I said something along the lines of, this isn't just eye candy, it's eye protein. I think it really gets the point across that it's like, yes, this does look really pretty, but it's not just there to look beautiful. It aids the storytelling, it aids the world building. It's protein, it's there for a reason, and I really appreciate that in this movie, every single choice that Guillermo del Toro makes was to further the story and to further the world building. Everything culminates to tell a story, and nothing is there just to be there. So it's hands down, no question about it. Directing and cinematography, 10 out of 10. The next category in the grid is going to be character aesthetics. This is going to be hair, makeup, and costumes. Pretty much any period piece movie is going to have a little bit higher than average just by its nature when it comes to costumes and, hair, things like that. But then this movie just takes it even above that with the amazing monster makeup, particularly when it comes to the Pale Man and the Fawn, both acted by Doug Jones. The craftsmanship that went into those are just beyond impressive. Also within the costumes, you have the homages to other very famous fantasy films, like the red shoes from The Wizard of Oz or the dress from Alice in Wonderland. And it just adds to the fairy tale fantasy feel. So you also have things like the fabric choices and the color choices that go into the color palettes of the fantasy world versus the real world. So every single choice when it comes to the costumes throughout this movie really aid the storytelling and are clearly made for a purpose. So yeah, character aesthetics, easily a 10 out of 10. The next category is going to be environmental aesthetics. This is going to include sets, props, and locations. If you want to learn more about the sets in this movie, I highly suggest you get a hold of either the DVD or the Blu-ray. Guillermo del Toro talks a lot about his decisions within the set design on the audio commentary, as well as throughout most of the special features. In the movie, all of the sets and props and locations, everything looks beautiful throughout. I probably would have given it a 10 out of 10 anyway for those categories, which, spoiler alert, I gave it 10 out of 10. But, once you hear him talk about every single choice he made, and you really start to notice just these intricate details that you don't necessarily notice, but I think on a subconscious level, it has an effect. So easily yet another 10 out of 10 category for the environmental aesthetics. The next category in my grid is going to be impact on film. And this one I divide up into 3 subcategories. We're going to have cult impact, critical impact, and inspirational impact. For critical impact, I easily gave it a full 5 out of 5 for that one. Like I mentioned before, it's mentioned in a lot of textbooks. It was accepted very well critically, and it's held up over the last over 10 years. For inspirational impact, I think it did inspire a lot of people as far as genre goes, as far as cinematography for sure. I think a lot of directors you can kind of see drew inspiration from this movie. Easily another 5 out of 5 there. And then the last one is going to be cult impact, and this one I gave a 4 out of 5, mostly because I feel like it's not quite mainstream enough to have a full-on cult impact. So overall for impact on film, it still got a 9.33, which is an A. The last category on my grid is going to be overall enjoyment. And I think it comes as no surprise that I gave it 10 out of 10. It's very nearly a perfect movie overall, certainly when it comes to enjoyability. It's not necessarily a fun film to watch, but it's just, it's visually appealing. It's a very compelling story. It's extremely well made overall. How can you not enjoy this movie? So, easily 10 out of 10, perfect. I also gave Pan's Labyrinth a few points of extra credit. The first point was simply because I watched this movie at least 2, maybe more times than that in film school, and had to dissect it and talk about it, and still like it after that. I always got excited when this came up on the syllabus, and I'm still excited to watch it. So yeah, it definitely has repeatability. You can definitely watch it, analyze it over and over and over again, always find something new, and always like it. I also gave it an extra point because this is the movie that introduced me to Guillermo del Toro. If you're not familiar with Guillermo del Toro, he's in a combination of Mexican movies and Hollywood movies. His Hollywood movies include Blade 2, Hellboy and Hellboy 2, Crimson Peak as one of his more recent ones, and then within his Spanish-speaking movies, he has obviously Pan's Labyrinth. He also has Kronos and Devil's Backbone. He's a very, very strong director. He's easily one of my favorites. Obviously, with the feedback I've been getting with this movie, yeah, I'm glad I was introduced to his work. Anytime it's got a movie coming out, you just gotta go see it. I'm really excited for The Shape of Water, which is coming out soon. On a similar note, if you're ever interested in auteur theory, which is where you study the collective works of a director, I highly suggest you go through Guillermo del Toro's work. It's a really interesting blend when you look at his Mexican, Spanish-speaking movies in comparison with his Hollywood, English-speaking movies. There's a lot of similarities, there's some differences, and it's just a really interesting experience. And I also highly suggest, if you ever get the chance, watching The Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth back to back, and then listening to the audio commentary for Pan's Labyrinth. It'll be an amazing experience, and you'll learn a ton. And I also gave this movie one last point of extra credit, just for all the homages to other movies. I just think it's fun, but it also adds to the story. The total score for this movie came extremely close to a perfect 100. I was tried to be very harsh in my judgments, and I think I did perhaps nitpick a little bit in a few of the categories, but regardless, this movie got a 99.13 total percentage on my grid. So it's extremely close to perfect. I obviously recommend it to anybody, maybe not kids. It's a fairy tale, but it's not for kids. Rated R for a reason. Yeah, for the most part, everybody should see this movie. If you have seen it, let me know if you think it's fair to say that this movie's pretty much basically a perfect movie. Did you find any flaws that I didn't? Let me know. So that's about it for the Nitty Griddy review of Pan's Labyrinth. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to subscribe to Griddy Films on YouTube. You can also follow Griddy Films on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And I have a Patreon account if you're interested in learning how you can help support Griddy Films. All of the social media accounts are linked on the YouTube page as well as on the Griddy Films website, which is going to be griddyfilms.com. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.